Welcome to the Apostolic Ink Podcast. Apostolic Ink is the official podcast of Dr. Jason Weatherly. In each episode, Dr. Weatherly addresses the tough theological issues of the 21st century church. No huff, no fluff, just thus, says the Word of God. And now, here's your host, Dr. Weatherly.
Thank you, anonymous radio announcer, and thank you, listening audience, for making the Apostolic Ink Podcast a part of your day. In this episode, I want to address a very practical but often overlooked ministry, and that is blended family ministry. Now, I'm not just talking about ministering to blended families. I mean allowing blended families to minister in our churches. A lot of families own a blender. Blended drinks and smoothies are everywhere. You've got breakfast smoothies, vegetable smoothies, fruit smoothies, entire businesses built around blenders and smoothies. And all these different ingredients. My wife even tricked me once into drinking a smoothie that had beets in it. But today, I want to talk to you about a different kind of blending. Not the kind you drink, but the kind you live. Because blended families are everywhere, and they're part of our churches, whether we talk about them or not. So let's take the blender metaphor and ask a real question. What are the ingredients to a blended family? Well, you take a new marriage, two pairs of children from previous relationship, two sets of house rules, and you throw them all in the blender. And then just like a real blender, everything starts spinning in a vortex. It forms a vacuum where all these ingredients pull together. And as you know, it's kind of loud in a blender. Like the tempest inside that blender, life in a blended family often involves a whirlwind of challenges, mixing his and hers and ours, plus in-laws and ex-laws, or is it outlaws? And then there's the power vacuum left behind by a departed spouse. Some couples seem to blend well right from the start, but most blend through trial, error, and struggle. Unfortunately, blended families don't always blend as smoothly as we'd like. Sometimes the texture of that blended family just isn't palatable compared to our expectations or our preconceptions of what a family should be. Blended families are unique from once married families in that they blend two pre-existing families into one home, but also extend to one or two other families who retain some sort of influence over the children. Blended marriages are foundationally different from first marriages in that the couples coming together have suffered loss and hurt in previous marriages. Outside forces as well as past emotional baggage pose a threat to blended marriages. Blended families need to rely on God's strength and power and center their relationship on Christ to give hope and strength through tough times. Because blended families begin with children and haven't had any time to build a shared history, they're facing the task required of a developed families while only possessing the experience of its own set of challenges right out of the gate. Some of those initial issues include figuring out what to call the step-parents. Is it mom? Is it dad? Or do you just call the adult by their name? Then there's the expectations for instant affection and the grieving of lost familial relationships. And one of the biggest challenges in ministering to and counseling blended families is learning how to identify and appreciate the peculiar qualities that work within each family. I want you to think about this just for a minute. Have you ever heard or preached a lesson on divorce and remarriage in your local congregation? I'm not talking about a lesson you heard on YouTube or another podcast. I'm talking about in your local church. Now think about how many blended families there are in your local congregation. Normally, when I ask this question while teaching at a church, the differences between how many people have actually heard a sermon on divorce and remarriage compared to the number of blended families in that church is staggering. Many apostolics have never heard a lesson on divorce and remarriage, let alone a positive message on divorce and remarriage. Yet divorce and remarriage absolutely occur in the church, and by extension, blended families make up a part of every one of our congregations. In fact, some of you listening right now may be a direct or indirect member of a blended family. A lot of Christian denominations tend to portray blended families as the exception, almost like an example of what not to do, rather norm of traditional families today. However, blended families represent a growing entity, not only in society, but most especially within the church. Do statistics justify the need for blended family ministry and counseling? Well, let's consider the following. 46% of marriages today are remarriages. 1 out of 3 Americans is now a step-parent, stepchild, step-sibling, or some other member of a blended family. More than half of Americans living today will live in at least one blended family situation in their lifetime. Back in 1997, experts predicted that by 2010, there would be more blended families in the U.S. than any other type of family. 50% of American children will see their parents divorce, and 50% of those children will see at least one parent divorce a second time. We all know that divorce and remarriage happen. It's been in practice since before Deuteronomy chapter 24. There were blended families back in the Bible days. In fact, some of the most prominent biblical families were blended families of some sort. I mean, technically, by definition, Jesus was raised by his stepfather, Joseph. And many Old Testament families with multiple marriages in complex dynamics of modern stepfamilies, dynamics that resulted in various sibling rivalries and favoritisms. Blended families are not a modern phenomenon. They have always been a part of God's people. We all have blended families in our local congregations. Yet Ron Deal, the best-selling author of the Smart Step Family book series, points out that most church leaders do not perceive the need to minister to blended families. Now, why is that? Blended families remain invisible to church leaders for 2 main reasons. First, there's a low percentage of blended families. In the church. Even though blended families may make up 25 to 39% of the general U.S. population, they only number about 6% on average in any given congregation. But more importantly, the number 2 reason why ministers and pastors don't perceive the need for blended families. Spiritual marginalization means that churches intentionally or unintentionally treat blended families as spiritually insignificant. Sometimes the members of a blended family believe they can no longer be used in God's kingdom. Other times the church communicates, directly or indirectly, that these families no longer qualify to be used in God's kingdom, and that creates deep wounds. Blended families are made to feel like unclean outsiders or second-class Christians who don't fit ideologically within their congregation. Many blended families remain closet stepfamilies within the church out of fear of judgment for the past and reminders of their differences. In fact, many churches don't want to perceive the need to minister to blended families because it challenges commonly held beliefs on marriage and family life. But if we, especially as apostolics, are going to be a body ministry, ministering holistically to the whole church body, we must include blended families. Now, your congregation may be doing better than other congregations, but as a whole, there is a void in how churches minister to blended families. For example, years ago, my wife and I attended a 4-lesson series on mentoring moms while I sat through the series of Courageous Dads. Not in one of those 8 lessons over the course of a month did either of us hear one mention of blurs that most blended family ministries in the early 21st century are the result of grassroots efforts of blended families themselves. And with the prevalence of blended families within society, pastors should include counseling blended families in their ministries, especially since parents of blended families often look toward the church for guidance. Blended families often encounter struggles and hardships that traditional, or dare I say, normal families never face. For example, how is a pastor supposed to counsel a blended family in their church who's struggling to raise their children with an uncooperative ex-spouse, as joint custody with a jerk? Author and professor of divorce recovery, Laura Pretherbridge, illustrates the need for blended family ministries by pointing out that the parenting dynamics between blended and traditional families are radically different. She suggests that pastors incorporate blended families into sermon illustrations to let other blended families know they are not alone. Children of blended families are less likely to be religious as adults. Issues such as attending mom's church and dad's church, even if they're in the same denomination, may prevent many children from developing a spiritual home or consistent religious routine. You see, it's called a blended family, but trying to meld two families into one can often feel more like living in a blender. Making a family work is challenging in and of itself, but then you add the constant whirlwind of activities, visitation, competing needs, uncooperative exes, and suddenly you've got the makings of a bad TV reality show. But blended families need the reassurance from the church that they are loved, they are accepted, and they still have a purpose. So given all these challenges, the statistics, the biblical precedent, the spiritual marginalization, and the real-life struggles, the question becomes, what can pastors actually do? How do pastors begin ministering to and counseling blended families? For one, they need to communicate a message of hope. They still have a purpose and a ministry in God's kingdom. Even as an organization, the UPCI licenses remarried ministers, that is, parents of blended families, as long as they can submit the proper documentation regarding the cause of their divorce. Now, if the UPCI as an organization licenses and ordains people who are remarried into the ministry, then local congregations shouldn't have any reservations about accepting blended families into their local ministries. Next, pastors need to educate leadership and church staff to consider blended family ministry as an evangelistic outreach effort. A blended family may feel the Holy Spirit drawing them to your local congregation, but still have reservations about whether or not they will be accepted or ostracized. Pastors also need to educate their staff and ministry teams on how to interact with families. Many of our churches have welcome centers or connect centers, and on the plus side, we're very proactive in welcoming our first-time guest. But imagine a first-time visiting blended family's anxiety when a well-meaning church greeter starts asking the parents, or worse, the children themselves, if the children have the same last names as the parent. You see, already before they set foot in your sanctuary, they're singled out as a blended family. Or you have a well-meaning minister, a Bible teacher who's teaching on families, and they put a slide on the monitor for the whole church to see that says, "Giving up option." Now, this is a very poor choice of words to describe divorce, because there are many parents of blended families who never gave up on their first marriage. The other partner did. Or that person had to make the tough decision because of the constant infidelity, or the mental and physical abuse to get out of a toxic marriage. And that really was the best option for them and their children. And it is a biblical option. Churches can create support groups or Bibles for blended families. We have Hyphen, which is college-age classes. We have singles classes. We have ladies' Bible study classes. So why not blended family classes? Even if you have one or two blended families in your local congregation, neighboring churches or even churches in one district sector to create a blended family ministry for that area. This is one of the things that Ron Deal focuses on in the Smart Step Family Ministry. He has weekly Zoom meetings where blended families can network with other blended families. Well, if we have blended families in our apostolic churches, then who better for them to network with than other apostolic blended families? Likewise, youth staffs need to develop counseling skills to minister to children of blended families to better incorporate them into their youth group and to help them spiritually grow. Finally, I want to leave you with some recommended reading for learning more about pastoral counseling for blended families. First and foremost is Ron Deal's website, smartstepfamilies.com. That's all one word, smartstepfamilies.com. Ron has articles that are geared directly at ministers and church leaders to help them in counseling blended families. He addresses the barriers in ministering to blended families and overcoming the stigma of appearing to be pro-divorce through blended family ministry. In addition, he offers legal and practical advice to ministers counseling children of blended families to safeguard the children, the minister, and the church. A book that I highly recommend by an apostolic author is John Carroll's An Introduction to Divorce and Remarriage, a Biblical Theology of Healing After Heartbreak. This is a book written by an apostolic who has walked a mile in a particular pair of shoes. It is a very detailed look into the biblical teachings of very many apostolics who have ever written on divorce and remarriage. The only other book that comes to my mind is Dr. Cindy Miller's book on divorce and remarriage, which was out of print for quite some time, and I think it's now currently available through Amazon and the Pentecostal Publishing House. Also, I would highly recommend David Instone Brewer's books on divorce and remarriage. Brother Carroll relies very heavily on Instone Brewer in his studies. Another author to look into is Laura Pretherbridge. She herself is a stepmother, and she writes books and web articles for Focus on the Family and other marriage and family websites from her experience as a Christian stepmother. Of course, there's my favorite book title, Joint Custody with a Jerk. This is more geared toward actual parents of blended families, but pastors can glean a lot from this book regarding some of the struggles blended families face. And finally, there is The Blended Marriage by Smalley and Smalley. The late Dr. Gary Smalley was a family counselor, and his son, Dr. Greg Smalley, likewise followed in his father's footsteps. This book offers both scriptural and personal insight for counselors and members of blended families. It has a simple design that would really work well as a foundational to start with counseling blended families. With so many available tools online and in printed form, there is no excuse for pastors and church leaders to neglect ministering to blended families. The mantra of the United Pentecostal Church International for many years has been the whole gospel to the whole world by the whole. That includes blended families, not only in being ministered to, but also in ministering to others. Ron Deal reminds pastors and ministers that ministering to blended families or using blended families in ministry does not mean they are pro-divorce any more than going to doctors makes one pro-illness. Any pastoral studies into family counseling or preaching on families should also include blended families. Blended family ministries no longer need to be the outcome of grassroots efforts from blended families themselves. Rather, blended families need reassurance from pastors and church leaders of their significance, not only in God's kingdom, but more importantly, within that local church. Such confirmation can be made through proper training and available tools in counseling blended families. Blended families are not an exception, an afterthought, or a footnote in the church. They are part of the body. They are part of the mission. They are part of God's people. And when the church embraces them fully with compassion and understanding and intentional ministry, we reflect the heart of Christ reform into his kingdom. I'm Dr. Weatherly, and this is the Apostolic Ink Podcast.